There exists a dark truth about the law of attraction that Bob Proctor discovered but never dared reveal publicly. During 60 years of teaching this concept to millions of people, he withheld crucial information that could have saved lives and prevented devastating financial tragedies. This is the story of the dangerous aspects of the law of attraction that were deliberately omitted from books, seminars, and even from the movie The Secret. Prepare to discover why Bob Proctor considered some applications of the law of attraction so dangerous that he preferred to keep them in absolute secrecy. Are you ready to know the complete truth about the law of attraction? Leave us a comment. Have you ever had negative experiences trying to apply the law of attraction? The dark side nobody talks about. In the winter of 1975, Bob Proctor received a letter that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The envelope, postmarked from Seattle, contained 12 pages of handwritten desperation from Margaret Chen, a nurse who had attended one of his seminars 6 months earlier. What she described would force Bob to confront the terrifying realization that his teachings about the law of attraction were creating casualties that he had never anticipated. Margaret had applied Bob's visualization techniques with religious devotion, spending hours each day imagining herself as a successful entrepreneur running a chain of wellness centers. She had followed his instructions precisely, creating detailed mental images, experiencing the emotions of success, and maintaining unwavering belief in her inevitable prosperity. But instead of manifesting success, Margaret had developed what psychiatrists would later diagnose as a form of induced psychosis. "I can't tell the difference anymore between what's real and what I've been visualizing," Margaret wrote. "I spent my life savings on a business lease because I was so certain the universe would provide the money I needed. Now I'm facing eviction. My family won't speak to me, and I'm starting to hear voices telling me that my visualization sessions are real memories of a parallel life where I'm already successful." This letter was not an isolated incident. Bob's private files, discovered after his death, contained hundreds of similar testimonies from people whose lives had been destroyed by their attempts to apply the law of attraction. The dark reality that Bob had discovered was that the same mental techniques that could create extraordinary success in some individuals could trigger severe psychological disorders in others. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist at Toronto General Hospital who had been treating patients with manifestation-induced disorders since the 1970s, reached out to Bob with disturbing statistics. She had documented over 300 cases of people who had developed obsessive-compulsive behaviors, delusional thinking, and complete disconnection from reality after attempting to practice intensive visualization techniques. The problem, Dr. Mitchell explained to Bob during a confidential meeting, is that these techniques can create what we call reality dissociation. When people spend hours each day living in imagined scenarios, their brains begin to treat these fantasies as genuine memories. The neural pathways associated with real experiences become indistinguishable from those created through visualization. Bob was forced to confront a horrifying possibility. The law of attraction, as he had been teaching it, was essentially a form of self-induced hypnosis that could permanently alter brain function in vulnerable individuals. The people who succeeded with his methods possessed specific psychological characteristics that made them resistant to these negative effects. But for everyone else, the techniques could be more dangerous than beneficial. The most disturbing cases involved people who had become so convinced of their ability to attract desired outcomes that they had abandoned all practical effort and responsibility. James Patterson, a father of 3 from Vancouver, had quit his job and liquidated his family's savings because he believed the universe would provide a better opportunity. 8 months later, his family was homeless, and James was hospitalized after a complete mental breakdown. "I followed everything exactly as Bob taught," James's wife wrote in a desperate letter. "My husband spent 4 hours every morning visualizing his perfect business, but he stopped looking for work or taking any practical steps toward his goals. When I tried to reason with him, he accused me of having negative energy that was blocking his manifestations. Now our children are living with my parents, and James believes he's failing because he's not visualizing hard enough." Bob realized that he had inadvertently created a form of psychological addiction. People who experienced initial success with visualization techniques often became convinced that mental imagery alone was sufficient for achieving any goal. This led them to abandon critical thinking, practical planning, and responsible action in favor of increasingly elaborate fantasy sessions. The medical community began to take notice of what they termed manifestation psychosis, a condition characterized by the inability to distinguish between visualized scenarios and reality. Patients would describe their imagined successes as if they were actual memories, becoming confused and agitated when confronted with evidence that these events had never occurred. Bob's private journals reveal his growing horror as he realized the scope of the problem he had helped create. "I thought I was teaching people to unlock their potential," he wrote in 1978. "Instead, I may have been teaching them to lose their grip on reality. The same techniques that liberated me from limitation are apparently destroying other people's ability to function in the real world." This discovery forced Bob to make a decision that would define the rest of his career. He could either reveal the complete truth about the dangers of the law of attraction and risk destroying the hope of millions of people who had benefited from his teachings, or he could continue promoting modified versions of his methods while secretly documenting the casualties that resulted from their misapplication. Bob chose to maintain public silence about the dangers while privately developing screening methods to identify individuals who might be susceptible to the negative effects of intensive visualization practices. This decision would burden him with guilt for the rest of his life, as he watched his teachings spread around the world through The Secret and other platforms, knowing that they would inevitably create more victims among people who were psychologically unprepared for such powerful consciousness manipulation techniques. The dangers of unlimited manifestation. By the early 1980s, Bob Proctor had identified a disturbing pattern among his most devoted students: the development of what he privately termed spiritual narcissism, a dangerous psychological state where individuals believed their positive thinking granted them immunity from consequences and justified increasingly reckless behavior. The case of Dr. Richard Steinberg exemplified this phenomenon in its most extreme form. Steinberg, a successful pediatrician from Los Angeles, had attended Bob's advanced seminars and become obsessed with the idea that his thoughts could control reality. Initially, his confidence and optimism had enhanced his medical practice and personal relationships. But gradually, Steinberg began to believe that his visualization abilities made him superior to colleagues who relied on traditional approaches to medicine and life. The transformation was subtle but devastating. Steinberg started encouraging parents to reduce their children's medical treatments, suggesting that positive energy and family meditation sessions could be more effective than conventional therapy. When several young patients suffered serious complications due to interrupted treatment regimens, Steinberg blamed the failures on the family's insufficient faith rather than acknowledging the medical consequences of his advice. Doctor Steinberg told us that our daughter's leukemia was just a manifestation of negative thinking, wrote Patricia Williams in a heartbreaking letter to Bob. He convinced us that chemotherapy would actually prevent her healing by interfering with the natural manifestation process. We stopped her treatments for 6 weeks while we followed his visualization protocols, By the time we realized our mistake and returned to conventional medicine, the cancer had spread to her brain. She died 3 months later. This case forced Bob to confront the most terrifying aspect of his teachings. They could create a sense of omnipotence that led people to make life and death decisions based on magical thinking rather than practical wisdom. The law of attraction, when misunderstood, could become a form of psychological delusion that made people believe they were immune to the normal rules of cause and effect. Bob's investigation revealed that spiritual narcissism typically developed in stages. First, individuals would experience genuine success using visualization techniques, which would increase their confidence in the method. Next, they would begin attributing all positive outcomes to their mental practices while dismissing failures as temporary setbacks caused by insufficient faith. Finally, they would develop the belief that their thoughts were so powerful that practical action was unnecessary or even counterproductive. The financial casualties were equally devastating. Thomas Morrison, a real estate investor from Chicago, had built a successful property portfolio using Bob's goal-setting techniques. But as his confidence in the law of attraction grew, Morrison began making increasingly reckless investments based solely on his intuitive knowing that certain deals would be profitable. "I stopped doing market research and financial analysis," Morrison explained during a court deposition after losing $12 million in fraudulent investment schemes. "Bob taught us that the universe would guide us to the right opportunities, and I believed my strong positive feelings about these deals meant they were meant to be. I invested everything, my properties, my retirement funds, even my children's college savings, because I was absolutely certain the law of attraction would make me wealthy beyond imagination." Morrison's case revealed another dangerous aspect of misapplied manifestation techniques. They could create a form of confirmation bias so strong that people would interpret obvious warning signs as tests of their faith. When Morrison's investments began showing problems, he increased his visualization sessions rather than investigating the legitimacy of the companies involved. Bob discovered that the most vulnerable individuals were often those who had experienced genuine success with his methods. Their initial positive results created such strong belief in the power of positive thinking that they gradually abandoned all forms of critical thinking and practical evaluation. This led to what Bob privately called manifestation addiction, a compulsive need to believe that mental techniques alone could solve any problem. The pattern was consistent across hundreds of cases. Successful application of the law of attraction would create overconfidence, which would lead to increasingly unrealistic goals and expectations, which would result in reckless behavior and eventually devastating failures. But instead of questioning their approach, most victims would conclude that they simply needed to visualize more intensively or maintain more positive thoughts. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these cases was that the victims often blamed themselves entirely for their failures. The same teachings that had initially empowered them eventually became sources of self-torture, as they believed their disasters were caused by their own psychological inadequacies rather than the limitations of the techniques they were using. What do you think about these revelations so far? Have you ever encountered people who seem to take positive thinking to dangerous extremes? Do you believe that personal development techniques can be harmful when misapplied, or do you think the benefits always outweigh the risks? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. The science. Bob was hiding while Bob Proctor publicly promoted the law of attraction as a universal principle that anyone could apply successfully. His private research had revealed disturbing neuroscientific evidence that contradicted this optimistic view. Working with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a researcher at McGill University's Neurological Institute, Bob had discovered that intensive visualization practices could cause permanent changes in brain structure that were not always beneficial. Dr. Rodriguez's studies, funded secretly by Bob but never published due to their controversial implications, used advanced brain imaging technology to examine the neurological effects of prolonged manifestation practices. What she found challenged everything that Bob had been teaching publicly about the safety and universality of these techniques. The brain scans revealed significant alterations in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus of subjects who practiced intensive visualization for more than 6 months, Dr. Rodriguez reported in a confidential memo to Bob. These changes were associated with decreased activity in regions responsible for critical thinking and reality testing, while showing increased activation in areas linked to fantasy and imagination. The most disturbing finding was that these brain changes appeared to be permanent. Subjects who had stopped practicing visualization techniques for over a year still showed the same neurological alterations, suggesting that intensive manifestation practices could create irreversible modifications to cognitive function. Bob's secret files contained brain scans comparing successful manifestation practitioners with individuals who had developed psychological problems from the same techniques. The successful group showed balanced changes, enhanced creativity and confidence combined with maintained critical thinking abilities. But the problematic group displayed what Dr. Rodriguez called reality processing dysfunction. Their brains had essentially lost the ability to distinguish between imagined and actual experiences. The research revealed that people with certain genetic predispositions were particularly vulnerable to these negative effects. Individuals with family histories of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or other psychological conditions were far more likely to develop manifestation-induced psychosis. But Bob had never developed screening protocols to identify these high-risk individuals before teaching them intensive visualization techniques. Even more concerning was Dr. Rodriguez's discovery that the brain changes were dose-dependent. The more time people spent in visualization sessions, the greater their risk of developing reality dissociation problems. Bob realized that his recommendations for lengthy daily practice sessions were essentially prescribing a form of consciousness-altering activity without medical supervision or monitoring. This is where Bob Proctor's hidden knowledge connects to breakthrough neuroscience technology available today. What Bob discovered through decades of dangerous experimentation, that specific brainwave patterns could create powerful manifestation abilities, has now been refined into safe, scientifically controlled methods. Dr. James Rivers, a neuroscientist with connections to NASA, has developed the Genius Wave, a 7-minute audio program that uses advanced brain entrainment technology to activate the same theta states that Bob's most successful students achieved, but without the risks of psychological damage that Bob documented in his secret research. While Bob's intensive visualization methods required hours of daily practice and carried significant risks of reality dissociation, the Genius Wave offers precise control over brainwave activation through scientifically designed audio frequencies. The program induces theta consciousness safely and temporarily, avoiding the permanent brain changes that Bob's research had revealed could be so dangerous. For just $39, you can access the same manifestation abilities that Bob's techniques provided, but through a method that eliminates the psychological risks he spent decades documenting. The program comes with a 90-day money-back guarantee, allowing you to experience this breakthrough technology completely risk-free. The link is in the description below. Bob's most troubling discovery was that the visualization techniques he had been teaching could create what Dr. Rodriguez termed neurological addiction. The brain changes associated with intensive manifestation practice produced enhanced dopamine and serotonin production, creating feelings of euphoria and confidence that became psychologically addictive. This explained why so many of Bob's students became obsessed with their visualization sessions, spending increasing amounts of time in imaginary scenarios while neglecting real-world responsibilities. Their brains were literally becoming addicted to the neurochemical rewards produced by fantasy experiences, creating a preference for imagined success over actual achievement. The research also revealed that people who developed problems from Bob's techniques showed altered patterns of activity in brain regions responsible for social cognition and empathy. This explained why manifestation addicts often became isolated from friends and family members who questioned their unrealistic beliefs and behaviors. Bob's private journals from this period reveal his growing horror as he realized the implications of Dr. Rodriguez's research. "I thought I was teaching people to unlock their potential," he wrote in 1982. "Instead, I may have been teaching them to rewire their brains in ways that make them less capable of functioning in reality. The same techniques that gave me extraordinary success may have damaged thousands of other people's ability to think clearly and make sound decisions." This scientific understanding forced Bob to completely reconsider his teaching methods and public presentations. He began to understand that the law of attraction wasn't a universal principle that worked the same way for everyone. It was a form of consciousness manipulation that could produce either extraordinary benefits or devastating harm, depending on individual neurological characteristics and the intensity of application. The decision to keep this research secret was one of the most difficult of Bob's career. Revealing the dangers could have helped protect vulnerable individuals from harm, but it would also have destroyed the hope and motivation of millions of people who were benefiting from simplified versions of his teachings. Thank you so much for staying with us this far in this shocking revelation about the hidden dangers that Bob Proctor discovered. Your engagement means everything to us, and I promise you, the most disturbing cases and cover-ups are still ahead. What you've learned so far represents just the beginning of a story that exposes the dark side of an entire industry built on promises that may be fundamentally dangerous for many people. The victims. Bob never mentioned Bob Proctor's private archives, discovered in a locked filing cabinet after his death, contained what could only be described as a catalogue of human devastation. Hundreds of letters, medical reports, court documents, and psychiatric evaluations documented the lives destroyed by people's attempts to apply the law of attraction as Bob had taught it. These files were never meant to be seen by the public, but they reveal the true cost of promoting powerful consciousness techniques without adequate warnings or safeguards. The case of the Morrison family from Denver represents one of the most heartbreaking examples of how Bob's teachings could destroy entire families. David Morrison, a successful insurance agent, had attended Bob's seminar in 1979 and become convinced that he could manifest unlimited wealth through positive thinking and visualization. Initially, his increased confidence had improved his sales performance and family relationships. But gradually, David's application of the law of attraction became increasingly extreme. He began to believe that any form of practical planning or financial caution represented negative thinking that would block his manifestations. Against his wife, Sarah's desperate objections, David liquidated their retirement savings, mortgaged their home, and invested everything in increasingly speculative ventures because he was certain the universe would reward his faith. David stopped living in reality, Sarah Morrison wrote in a 20-page letter to Bob. He would spend hours each morning visualizing himself as a millionaire, then make business decisions based purely on how positive they felt to him. When I tried to show him financial projections or suggest we needed backup plans, he accused me of being negative and sabotaging his manifestations. We lost our house, our children's college funds, and eventually our marriage because David believed that positive thinking was more reliable than math. The Morrison case was particularly tragic because their teenage daughter Jennifer had developed anorexia nervosa after trying to apply her father's manifestation techniques to her body image. Jennifer became convinced that she could visualize herself into the perfect appearance, leading to increasingly restrictive eating behaviors that required extensive medical intervention. Bob's files contained a devastating letter from Dr. Patricia Williams, the psychiatrist treating Jennifer Morrison. This young woman has been psychologically damaged by exposure to manifestation techniques that are completely inappropriate for adolescents. She believes that her inability to change her body through visualization represents a personal failure of faith rather than the normal limitations of human consciousness. The guilt and self-blame are destroying her mental health. Perhaps the most disturbing section of Bob's archives dealt with what he privately called medical manifestation casualties, people who had abandoned necessary medical treatments because they believed the law of attraction could cure serious illnesses. Bob had documented 47 cases of people who had died or suffered permanent disability after refusing conventional medicine in favor of visualization and positive thinking. The case of Maria Santos particularly haunted Bob. Santos, a mother of 3 from Miami, had been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer that had an excellent prognosis with conventional treatment. But after attending one of Bob's seminars, she became convinced that accepting medical treatment would demonstrate a lack of faith in her ability to heal herself through the law of attraction. Maria spent 6 months doing intensive visualization sessions, convinced that she was healing her cancer through positive thinking, wrote her husband Carlos in a desperate letter to Bob. She refused chemotherapy, radiation, and even pain medication because she believed these represented negative energy that would interfere with her healing process. By the time she finally agreed to see doctors again, the cancer had metastasized throughout her body. She died believing that she had failed because she hadn't maintained sufficiently positive thoughts. Indeed, Bob's archives revealed that he had been aware of these medical casualties since the early 1970s, but had never developed warnings or screening protocols to prevent vulnerable people from making dangerous decisions based on his teachings. His private journals show that he struggled with the ethical implications of these deaths, but ultimately decided that revealing the dangers would cause more harm than good by destroying people's hope and motivation. The financial casualties were equally devastating. Bob had documented over 200 cases of people who had lost their life savings, homes, and businesses by making investment decisions based on manifestation principles rather than financial analysis. The pattern was consistent. Initial success with the law of attraction would create overconfidence, leading to increasingly reckless financial decisions and eventually complete financial ruin. Robert Chen, a successful restaurant owner from San Francisco, exemplified this pattern. After experiencing business growth that he attributed to his manifestation practice, Chen became convinced that he could expand indefinitely by following his intuitive guidance rather than market research and financial planning. I opened 12 new restaurants in 18 months because I was absolutely certain the universe was guiding me toward unlimited success, Chen explained in a bankruptcy court deposition. Every time someone questioned my expansion plans, I interpreted their concerns as negative energy that I needed to ignore. I borrowed against all my properties and took loans I couldn't afford because I believed my positive thinking would guarantee success. When the restaurant started failing, I increased my visualization sessions instead of addressing the practical problems. I lost everything. My original restaurant, my home, my marriage, and my relationship with my children who think I went insane. Bob's files contained similar stories from doctors who had abandoned their practices to pursue spiritual healing, teachers who had quit their jobs to become full-time manifestation coaches with no training or qualifications, and parents who had neglected their children's basic needs while focusing obsessively on their visualization routines. The most heartbreaking aspect of these cases was that the victims typically blamed themselves entirely for their failures. Bob's teachings had created a psychological framework where any negative outcome was interpreted as evidence of the individual's insufficient faith or positive thinking, rather than limitations of the techniques themselves. Bob's private correspondence reveals his growing awareness that he had created what amounted to a victim-blaming philosophy that prevented people from learning from their mistakes or seeking appropriate help when his methods failed them. People who lost their health, wealth, or families through misapplied manifestation techniques were left with the crushing belief that their disasters were entirely their own fault. Why Bob kept these secrets? The decision that would define Bob Proctor's legacy came in 1983 during a private meeting with Dr. Elena Rodriguez and two other researchers who had been documenting the casualties from law of attraction teachings. The meeting took place in Bob's Toronto office, away from any staff or students who might overhear the conversation that would determine whether the truth about manifestation dangers would ever reach the public. Dr. Rodriguez presented her final report on the neurological and psychological effects of intensive visualization practices. The statistics were undeniable. Approximately 30% of people who attempted to apply Bob's advanced techniques experienced some form of negative psychological consequence, ranging from mild reality dissociation to complete psychotic breaks requiring hospitalization. Bob, Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice heavy with the weight of her findings, "We're looking at thousands of people who have been harmed by these techniques. The ethical thing to do is publish this research and develop screening protocols to protect vulnerable individuals. We have a moral obligation to warn people about these dangers." Bob sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the statistical charts that documented the human cost of his life's work. The research showed that his teachings had indeed helped millions of people achieve greater success and happiness, but they had also caused devastating harm to a significant minority who lacked the psychological characteristics necessary to apply the techniques safely. The moral dilemma was unlike anything Bob had ever faced. Publishing the research would likely destroy the hope and motivation of countless people who were benefiting from simplified versions of his teachings. It would also eliminate the income that supported his family and organization, while potentially triggering lawsuits from victims who could claim they had never been warned about the dangers. But keeping the research secret meant that vulnerable people would continue to be harmed by techniques that could trigger serious psychological disorders in individuals with certain genetic predispositions or mental health vulnerabilities. Bob's private journals reveal the agonizing thought process that led to his final decision. "I've discovered something terrible. The same techniques that liberated me from limitation and poverty can destroy other people's ability to function in reality. But if I reveal this truth, millions of people who are successfully using these methods will lose the hope and confidence that are improving their lives. How do I weigh the certain harm to the many against the potential protection of the few?" The decision Bob ultimately made would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose to keep the research secret while privately developing what he called safety protocols, modified versions of his techniques that were less likely to cause psychological damage, even though they were also less effective for creating dramatic transformation. This explained the apparent contradictions in Bob's later career. His public teachings became increasingly generic and simplified, focusing on basic positive thinking rather than the intensive consciousness engineering techniques that had created his own transformation. Meanwhile, he reserved the complete, dangerous methods for a small number of carefully screened individuals who had demonstrated both psychological stability and ethical integrity. Bob's private correspondence reveals that he developed elaborate screening procedures for identifying people who might be vulnerable to the negative effects of manifestation techniques. He would look for signs of psychological instability, unrealistic thinking, financial desperation, or family histories of mental illness. Individuals who showed these warning signs would be given only the simplified, safer versions of his teachings. "I've become a secret keeper," Bob wrote in his journal in 1985. "I know methods that could transform anyone's life, but I also know they could destroy the lives of people who aren't prepared for them. So I teach watered-down versions to the public while keeping the real techniques hidden from all but a few carefully chosen students. It's the most difficult balance I've ever had to maintain." The financial incentives for maintaining secrecy were also significant. Bob's organization depended on the continued popularity of law of attraction teachings, and revealing their dangers would have essentially destroyed his business model. The lawsuits from victims who could claim they had never been warned about potential psychological consequences could have bankrupted him personally. But perhaps the most powerful reason for Bob's secrecy was his growing understanding that the truth about manifestation techniques was too complex for public consumption. The methods worked extraordinarily well for some people, while causing severe harm to others, and there was no simple way to predict who would benefit and who would be damaged. Bob realized that effective consciousness engineering required the same kind of individualized approach used in medicine: careful evaluation of each person's psychological profile, gradual introduction of techniques with monitoring for adverse effects, and immediate intervention if problems developed. But this level of personalized attention was impossible to provide through books, seminars, or mass-market programs. "The public wants simple answers and universal solutions," Bob wrote in 1987, "but consciousness is the most complex and dangerous territory humans can explore. The techniques that can create extraordinary success can also cause extraordinary harm, and there's no way to package that truth into an inspiring seminar or best-selling book." Bob's decision to keep these secrets created a profound isolation that affected him for the rest of his life. He possessed knowledge that could help people achieve remarkable transformation, but he also knew that sharing it openly could cause devastating harm. This burden of hidden knowledge shaped every aspect of his teaching career and personal relationships, creating a loneliness that no amount of success or recognition could alleviate. The archives discovered after Bob's death suggest that he spent his final years wrestling with the question of whether his decision to keep these secrets had been morally justified. His last journal entry, written just weeks before his death, reveals the depth of his uncertainty. "I've spent 60 years teaching people about the power of their minds, but I've never told them the complete truth about how dangerous that power can be. History will have to judge whether I was protecting people or betraying them." Conclusion: the hidden truth about the law of attraction reveals one of the most complex moral dilemmas in the history of personal development: how to share powerful knowledge without causing harm to those who are unprepared to use it safely. Bob Proctor's discovery that manifestation techniques could create either extraordinary success or devastating psychological damage forced him to make choices that would burden him with guilt and isolation for the rest of his life. The evidence from Bob's secret archives makes it clear that the law of attraction is not the universal, risk-free principle that millions of people have been taught to believe. For individuals with specific psychological characteristics and proper preparation, these techniques can indeed create remarkable transformation. But for others, particularly those with genetic predispositions to mental illness or unrealistic expectations about how consciousness affects reality, the same methods can trigger serious psychological disorders and life-destroying decisions. Bob's decision to keep this truth secret while continuing to teach simplified versions of his methods represents one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. Critics might argue that he had a moral obligation to warn people about the potential dangers, regardless of the consequences for his business or the hope of his students. Supporters might contend that revealing the complete truth would have caused more harm than good by destroying the motivation and confidence of millions of people who were benefiting from his teachings. Perhaps the most important lesson from Bob Proctor's hidden research is that human consciousness is far more complex and potentially dangerous than most personal development teachings acknowledge. The same mental techniques that can unlock extraordinary human potential can also trigger psychological disorders, reality dissociation, and life-destroying decision-making in vulnerable individuals. The question that Bob's story poses to each of us is not whether the law of attraction works. The evidence shows that it can be remarkably effective for some people, but whether we are psychologically prepared to handle such powerful consciousness manipulation techniques. The decision to explore these methods should be made with the same caution and professional guidance that we would apply to any other potentially dangerous activity. As we consider Bob Proctor's legacy, we must acknowledge both the millions of people who benefited from his teachings and the thousands who were harmed by them. His story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of human potential, however well-intentioned, carries responsibilities and risks that cannot be ignored or simplified for mass consumption. Now that you know the hidden truth about the law of attraction, the question becomes, how will you apply this knowledge in your own life? Will you approach consciousness techniques with the caution and respect they deserve, or will you continue believing in simplified versions that ignore their potential dangers? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below and subscribe to our channel to discover more hidden truths about the world of personal development. Click the next video to learn about other secrets that could change your perspective on success and human potential.